Hello and welcome. We are delighted to have you here for this online preaching event. My name is Lee Hull Moses, and I serve in the Office of General Minister and President as the Executive Director of the Proclamation Project, which is our initiative to support and equip disciples preachers in proclaiming the good news. We are providing translation into Spanish today, so let me first thank Daphne Gascott-Arias for helping us out with that. And I would like to invite her to share some instructions for anyone who wants to access that translation.
Buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Es un gusto estar aquí y traducir para ustedes. Si necesitan o prefieren escuchar la traducción al español, solamente tienen que llamar al número 508-924-3627. Lo van a poner aquí en la pantalla y van a escucharme a mí hablando. Eso es todo. That's all. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you, Daphne. I am grateful to all of you who have set aside some time today to think about your preaching. And we have a great event planned here with Dr. Casey Sigmon. Before we get started, let me remind you that you can find information about all the Proclamation Project initiatives at disciples.org/preaching, including information about grants for bivocational preachers, upcoming events, and preaching resources. Let me also say a few things about this platform that we are using today, especially if you haven't been to an event with us before. This platform works best if you are on a laptop or a desktop. So if you are watching from a mobile device like a phone or an iPad, you may not be able to access all of the interactive features. We've also found that it works best if you are using Chrome as your internet browser. So if you're having trouble, you might try switching browsers. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a chat function. And if you haven't found that yet, if you'd like to go there and say hi and tell us where you're watching from. You will also see a Q&A function there. We will have some time for questions with Dr. Sigmon after her keynote. So if you have questions, please post them there in that Q&A function, not in the chat. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. At the end of our time together, we'll have an opportunity for you to connect with each other in small groups, if you'd like to. This will be purely optional, to talk through some of what you heard today, and I'll have some other instructions about that a little bit later. Now, though, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Casey Sigmon. Dr. Sigmon is an ordained disciples, pastor, and scholar. She teaches preaching and worship at St. Paul's School of Theology, and she is active in the greater Kansas City region. She received her MDiv from McCormick Theological Seminary and her PhD in homiletics and liturgy from Vanderbilt University Divinity School. She's also the creator of the Pause Play Center for Preachers, which provides space and encouragement for preachers to reignite their imagination through rest and play. Dr. Sigmon's research focuses on the impact of technology on our religious lives, and she has a new book coming out next year called Engaging the Gadfly, Moving from Reactionary to Reflective Online, Hybrid, and In-Person Preaching in the Digital Age. We invited Dr. Sigmon to talk with us today about the ever-evolving world of artificial intelligence and how it impacts and informs our preaching. I don't know about all of you, but I have found myself at a bit of a loss when it comes to where to start thinking about all this. I have been inspired by some of you who are using AI in creative and life-giving ways in your preaching, and I've also been daunted by the complex questions that it raises for how we proclaim the good news for the people of God. So I'm really grateful that we can call on wise teachers like Dr. Sigmon to be our guide. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for setting aside time to be here in community for this event. And thank you again to the Proclamation Project for this opportunity to share my research this afternoon. So in the next 40 minutes, I intend to touch on many aspects of generative AI and its impact on preaching. This is just the beginning. This is just the start of the conversation. There is no one size fits all for this topic, but this keynote seeks to establish a common understanding of what generative AI is how it works, and what some of the current platforms are before moving into why it matters. Thank you very much. So in the moves for this afternoon, I'll begin by describing generative AI and some common platforms, explore who is using generative AI and why, demonstrate some possible ways to engage generative AI in preaching, seek to understand some of the limits of generative AI for preaching. And my hope is that you will walk away with a clearer understanding of essential human aspects of preaching that are, up until now, taken for granted. Let's go ahead to the next slide. My central theme for us is that the rise of the chatbots teaches us an overlooked essential aspect of preaching, that it is an art of ministry practiced by humans for humans. Our frailty can be our strength. Our feelings and experiences are vital components of this art form. Generative AI cannot replicate the art of crafting and delivering sermons as a human made in the image of God. Let's hear what ChatGPT has to say about itself. Here from an interview that a researcher did with ChatGPT back in December of 2022. The chatbot says, it's important for people to understand that conversational agents like myself are not human, and we don't have the same abilities or characteristics as humans. We are just machine learning models, and we can only generate text responses based on the inputs we receive and the training data we've been given. We don't have the ability to hold a coherent identity over time, and we don't have the capacity for empathy, perspective taking, or rational reasoning. Some of us may fear artificial intelligence's presence. Others of us have a lot of curiosity and excitement for the opportunities to play with these platforms. I think most of us bounce in between. But I always tell my students a quote from Melvin Kranzberg, who is a historian of technology, and that is this: we must keep in mind that any technological tool that comes to us isn't necessarily good or inherently bad or neutral. And so it takes communal discernment to decide how best to engage with technologies, our why for engaging with them, as well as our how. We can go to the next slide. In other words, generative AI, whose platforms that are text-based are called chatbots, is based on machine learning over time. The machines are fed words to such a great extent that patterns are learned by the machines, and predictions then can be made about which word should follow the next word in response to a prompt from a human. We saw the early stages of this technology when text prediction began to appear on our cell phones suddenly, trying to autocorrect what we're typing and anticipate what we're trying to text to our friends and family. These machines use mimicry. They're not creating original ideas and original phrases. It's all a game of prediction, not based on experience, intuition, or rational reasoning, as ChatGPT told the Times back in 2022. I'm going to share now just a few of the platforms that are currently available to us when it comes to generative AI. So first of all, there is Gemini, and that's the icon that looks like a compass there on your screen. This chatbot was formerly known as Bard in the beginning, developed by Google. The latest Google phone highlights the omnipresence of Gemini across its apps and functions as this assistant and presence and partner who you can ask questions of at any time. Next, there is Stability AI. This is an artificial intelligence company founded in 2019 that is best known for its capacity to create images from text. It also uses generative AI to create audio, mimicking the voice of others and saying whatever you want to make it say. Next is probably the most familiar platform available, and that's ChatGPT. This was created and developed by OpenAI, a company focused on developing platforms from generative AI like Stability AI. ChatGPT was released at the end of 2022. And this is what's so fascinating to me, that while it was released at the end of 2022, in January of 2023, ChatGPT became the fastest app to hit 100 million users in history. So in just under 2 months. And the average number of daily users that January was about 13 million daily users. We'll explore here in a moment who might be using it and why, but chances are many of you and many people you know are using ChatGPT. The next platform that you might be familiar with if you use Zoom a lot is Otter AI. This is a Zoom assistant or an omnipresent assistant who can stand in and take notes for you in meetings such as this. And who knows, there may be some Otter AIs here in the meeting today taking notes. Otter AI was founded back in 2016 for speech-to-text transcription. The application can take notes for you, extract action items from those notes, record audio, capture slides, all as you're sitting in a meeting. And again, some of you might be using it right now. We can compare notes and see how well Otter AI does. Next is Perplexity AI, which looks like a spinning book there on the screen. Perplexity AI markets itself as a more reliable, verifiable search engine. But instead of links to sources, this chatbot summarizes information for you using data pulled off the internet. And it has access to the most current information rather than a platform like ChatGPT. I played around with Perplexity AI this week and was really shocked to see what it pulled up when I asked it, who is Casey Sigmon? And it instantly created like a web page for me with a summarization of my background, images of myself from places on the internet, links to where there are about me sections all over the internet, and even created a pool of, if you're interested in AI and technology, click here, based on my interests and my experiences on my resume online. So Perplexity AI is pretty scary in its accuracy, but you should check it out for yourself. Finally, there's Copilot. This is Microsoft's offering of a generative AI platform. Like Gemini from Google, it's designed to be this omnipresent chatbot. Remember the Clippy, the paper clip from back in the day? It's like the next level Clippy, basically. And it's able to create images, again, summarize information, and organize your day as your AI co-pilot. Millions of people, as I said a moment ago, are using generative AI on a daily basis. From early 2023 to now, generative AI use went from basically zero to millions of users. So what are millions of humans using a chatty bot for? Surely some are simply curious and playing around with this new technology, guilty as charged, but it's research, right? It's not, just leisurely play. Professors around the world took a while to discover that many students quickly used these chatbots to complete assignments, and soon found out that, ironically, the generative AI that has been created to detect plagiarism from chatbots doesn't work very well at all at diagnosing the use of another chatbot. Realtors embrace ChatGPT, using it to generate attention-grabbing descriptions of real estate and even to draft legal documents. Medical professionals are using generative AI for image analysis, scanning medical images for the detection of disease. They also use it to create personalized treatment based on patient medical records. And in June of 2023, around 300 people gathered in the nave of St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Fürth, Germany. They gathered for the worship service with anticipation and trepidation. But this anticipation and trepidation were not about the content of the worship service or the church making a tough decision that day. Instead, it was all about who or what was leading worship that day. Because the whole of the liturgy, including the songs and even the faces on the screen and the sermon, was prepared and delivered by AI chatbots. What might preachers consider engaging with generative AI for? Realtors and medical professionals are using the technology to more efficiently and quickly analyze data for particular purposes, but you notice they're not using them to sell the house and buy the house themselves, or replacing the human doctor and nurse with these chatbots yet. So what can we learn from these professionals who are engaging with generative AI? What is not only allowable, but beneficial? We can go to the next slide. This is not an all-inclusive list for us. It's just some suggestions on how we might engage with chatbots in the sermon process. Notice I don't suggest that pastors should go ahead and delegate the entire task of preaching to a chatbot, unless you're doing an experiment and have critical reflection as a community afterward, as was the case for that church in Germany. For one, the process of writing and sketching a sermon manuscript, outline, plan for preaching without notes, cultivates a clear understanding in the pastor of what God is up to in a particular time and place. A colleague and friend of mine who is in the design world and marketing world and has found quickly that her art and skill is being replaced by chatbots shared with her audience on Threads the other day a quote from Pulitzer Prize winning author David McCullough, and that is to remember that writing is thinking. To write well is to think clearly. So what are the costs for the ministry of proclamation if the process of writing is replaced by use of chatbots? Where does theologizing then take place? Pastors who preach are being formed spiritually by the practice of preparing sermons week in and week out in many ways that increase the effectiveness of our ministry as a whole and also shape the ecclesiology and mission and purpose of the body of Christ. Preaching for the pastor as well as the congregation is formational. It's not just informational. I'll say that again. Preaching is formational. It is not just informational. So generative AI certainly could re-energize the preaching process for some, especially for those who've been in the weekly practice for a long time. Moving from idea generation around the sermon text onto playing with different sermon forms or styles to see the impact, or asking a generative AI platform to edit or clean up the text, it can be helpful and beneficial. Why don't we take a look at some of these examples? But first, how about we ask ChatGPT what is the best use of it for sermon process? Let's go ahead and watch that video. You're going to see just how quickly ChatGPT can create a response for you. Much faster than I can type. And here we go. So for those of you who may have a hard time seeing the text on the screen, just to summarize, ChatGPT right now has organized the response in 8 moves, and each move has 2 points. The first point is the AI tools that are available to help at that stage of sermon development, and the second point shares how to engage those tools for the sermon. So move 1 is topic selection. ChatGPT suggests that you can brainstorm issues and themes relevant to your contemporary audience, and that's the language that is used there. The second move is exegesis, and AI suggests that it can help you find and summarize texts, as well as offer a summary of theological and historical perspectives for you. Third, ChatGPT can help you with a sermon outline if you provide the theme and key points. The list continues as AI suggests that it is useful in refining conclusions, suggesting illustrations, transitions, and stories. And as you go down the list, you see redundancies in the suggestions starting to take place, and that some of the moves are really just a reiteration of earlier suggestions, just rephrasing previous statements. But notice that all of these suggestions from ChatGPT do rely upon the discerning guidance of a human preacher interacting with the tool to plan, study for, organize, and deliver a sermon. Now, let's see what happens when the human preacher outright asks ChatGPT to write a sermon based on a selected text. In this case, I asked it to write a sermon for Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. Let's see what it does. So you see, in 1 minute, less than 1 minute, we have a sermon outlined for us. The chat bot has created a title, The Relentless Love of God. It has created an introduction that then goes into the inclusion of the scripture reading, and then a simple 3-point sermon plus conclusion / benediction, and even a closing prayer. I've played around with ChatGPT many times with students, and I consistently find that this is the pattern offered when you ask broadly to have the platform write a sermon without any more specifics into the style, the context, etc. It loves the 3-point sermon, and it always concludes with a let us pray type of prayer. I also notice other things when I ask a very broad prompt to ChatGPT in writing the sermon. One is that it uses exclusively male language for God. It loves to use the phrase brothers and sisters throughout. And again, anytime you get to prayers, the chat bot loves the let us language of prayer. So what's really interesting to me is to think about the fact, again, if this platform is creating content based on what's predictable, and it's been trained on countless online sermon texts, then we see reflected back to us as preachers those predictable moves for the sermon, right? And I think that can help us and inform us to be like, if that's what's anticipated, perhaps what am I missing here? What's the contrapuntal to this cliche, tropey version of a sermon based on the text? But it's more important to reflect on what is not seen in a sermon written by ChatGPT like this. And that's personality. That's humanity. The humanity of the preacher, because, hey, as ChatGPT said earlier, I'm not a human. But you also don't really see an image, a sense of who the congregation is as a people, and in what particular time and place they are rooted in a sermon like this. Now, at times, homileticians have celebrated and lamented the personality of the preacher in the sermon. In this time of artificial intelligence, Personality, I think, can be a welcome antidote to disembodied information based on predictive language models that artificial intelligence can provide for us. But you know what? Maybe the fault is that I offered a bad prompt. Like, it could be a bad prompt to start with. Maybe AI can predict particularity if I'm more particular in the prompt that I write. So why don't we see now how ChatGPT assumes that a sermon based on the same pericope would be shaped for a Disciples of Christ congregation. Let's go ahead and see what shows up. Do you notice some interesting changes right up front? And I did these prompts back to back, so no time had really passed. But we have a new title for the sermon, Under the Wings of the Mother Hen. And I was so curious I wanted to ask ChatGPT, why did you go with a less deductive and more poetic title for this sermon for the Disciples of Christ congregation than you did for the broad prompt to write a sermon? Notice also that we do not have the welcome of dear brothers and sisters. Also notice that my committee meeting popped up in the video. I'm sorry about that. Instead of dear brothers and sisters in Christ, we now have a greeting to the beloved community. We also lose the introduction to the scripture reading, and we jump right into the introduction of the sermon and three moves of the sermon. But the titles for each of those moves are not the same, and the content is not the same either with this sermon. And we see inclusive language for God throughout, replacing the exclusive use of he pronouns from the first sermon. So in the first sermon that was generated broadly, without tagging a denomination or tradition to it, move one was entitled The Relentless Pursuit of God's Mission. And it focused on our call to a purpose-driven life in which God works through us. But for the Disciples of Christ sermon, the move changes to, quote, an urgent call for transformation. And the focus of the content here is on Jesus and Jesus seeing through the superficiality of Herod's political power. So instead also of rhetorical questions at the end of each move from the first sermon that are exclusively personal, one-on-one, you and your relationship with God questions, the final paragraph of this move suggests societal application and attention to injustice in systems that we are called to face, even if they are dangerous. In the first generic sermon, Move 2 was entitled The Heartbreak of Rejection, and it led to an invitation for the congregation to consider where we are rejecting God's loving embrace in our lives. But in the Disciples of Christ version, the center is on Jesus's heart that is, quote, both prophetic and compassionate, and how that heart is a model for our lives. Instead of being asked rhetorically how we are rejecting God's embrace as individuals, our agency shifts as a congregation to the imitation of Christ's mother hen heart for the vulnerable in our midst, even when it is, quote, inconvenient or challenging. Then the final move of the first sermon was, quote, the hope of restoration. And it called us, again, a generic us, to trust in God's ultimate plan for restoration and hope, no matter how desolate things may seem. For the Disciples of Christ sermon, we end with a call to individual and collective reflection and action, not just waiting for the sovereign God to make things better in his own time, but to participate in the work of restoration. While in the first sermon, our closing prayer was addressed to our Heavenly Father, asking God to help us do and remember exactly what the sermon had outlined before. We don't have a closing prayer at the conclusion of this Disciples of Christ sermon. We have a set of may we statements followed by an amen. So I found this like completely fascinating. And as I tell my students all the time, well, of course, I'm a professional nerd. I get to be a nerd for a living. But just to see, again, what is predictive or what is reflected back based on different traditions with the same text. So I find these sort of exercises helpful, right? They can be helpful for us. They can be a way of cultivating self-awareness for us, for a preacher to see what's reflected back when AI is generating a message in our tradition. Nonetheless, still in this sermon, there really isn't much in the way of personality, personal stories, a sense of who the preacher is, and a sense of who the congregation is outside of being a typical disciples of Christ congregation that uses inclusive language for God, is concerned about individual and also social justice and holiness and reconciliation. So that's just two examples of creating a sermon from scratch, but I want to show you two other ways that you can engage ChatGPT, this time after you've written at least one draft of your sermon manuscript. So this clip that you're about to see shows you how quickly AI can summarize my material, again, on my original sermon on Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35 that I wrote without the chatbot. But you can see here in the next slide how it summarizes my material, how quickly it does. And this sermon is about 2,000 words, and it summarizes it this way, really quickly. So what I find really helpful about this summary function is, again, when you are, if you haven't delivered the sermon yet and you're trying to make sure that your flow makes sense and is clear, this function can be, again, a good helpful mirror or tool to reflect back with you what it's seeing as the overarching themes of each of the sermon. But also, if you're trying to think about ways that you want to summarize the sermon for a newsletter or place it in other areas, you could use ChatGPT as a first draft, right, that you can refine and fix if you're having writer's block and just feeling stuck in general. The same can be said for your different parts of the sermon, an introduction, a conclusion, any pieces where you want to see the clarity and the main points of your manuscript. Now let's look at how quickly ChatGPT can translate my sermon of 2,000 words into a set of social media tweets or threads, including hashtags and emojis. Let's check this out on the next slide. So this is my favorite use of ChatGPT for the sermon process at the moment. Perhaps it's years of academic training. No offense to my mentors but it's formed me to write overly complicated run-on sentences. I love how AI can make my prose very concise, focused, and simple enough for social media. Even if I never posted one of these on Threads or on the platform formerly known as Twitter, I think it's really fun to play around with these phrases. For one, they can then be placed in my sermon and strategic points as refrains for the message. I can place them on slides or in the lower third if I'm preaching online. I can use them in the bulletin, and I also can share them on social media. And it's done so quickly. And I even really love the icons and images. So they love to use hearts, but it's nice to not have to think of what emoji would fit with the tweet. They do that for you. But again, this content is mine. It's for my congregation, and I don't have to spend an hour or more coming up with pithy phrases to summarize the sermon. I can share it pretty quickly on our social media platforms thanks to AI. One other quick detail I wanted to share just about using ChatGPT, and I'm using the free version in all of these clips. I know that the paid versions can handle more material. So when I try to play around with ChatGPT summarizing something that's more lengthy, like 10,000 words, the free version says, absolutely not, that's too much, I'm overwhelmed, and shuts down. So about 2,000 to 3,000 words is the sweet spot for doing this sort of interactive play with the platform around sermon preparation. Now, as much as I enjoy playing around with AI, I am fully aware of the risks that are involved. So we'll go to those. And I'm basically going to summarize them in this outline. There is a tendency for some of us to set up machines as being these infallible, unbiased information givers, that their efficacy is so much more superior to humans with our bias and our weariness and our inefficiency. But that is simply not the case. A machine that learns through scanning materials on the internet and material created by humans and fed to it by humans is also going to be infallible and make mistakes and could potentially do some harm. And that is also because, as we saw in that early slide in the interview from ChatGPT, this machine is not using empathy or logic to discern a response to a prompt, and that's going to inherently cause problems. So, point one, real quick, basic. Using the slang of my children, it's basic. And that's the first benign critique of generative AI when you are offering a basic sermon or liturgy, again, with no personality, totally based on predictive machine learning, and devoid of a sense of the context and contextuality of the time, the place, and the people. Whatever sermon it creates is going to just be based on patterns of what information the machine has been fed, for better or worse. And we don't need more basic preaching out there, right? Point two, bias. More importantly, researchers are noticing the embedded bias of these chatbots. Generative AI bias exists for many reasons. One reason is that generative AI's learning, again, has mostly been centered on Western views and the English language. Its programming and patterning does not understand non-Western and non-English ways of knowing. One of the reasons why those platforms that are created to detect generative AI and the use of chatbots is so dangerous is that what researchers are finding is that it's flagging the writing of non-Western, non-English writing, and even when it's original, because of its bias. So related to this bias in that form of training is that the content that's created and posted on the internet reflects the bias of white supremacy culture. Researchers reveal AI language models have, quote, racist, sexist, ageist, ableist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, deceitful, derogatory, culturally insensitive, hostile, and other forms of adverse content spitting out because it's just predicting based on patterns found on the internet. ChatGPT and other chatbots do not intend to spout out derogatory content. They are not conscious of what they say. And many programmers are trying to address this toxic bias that has infiltrated the chatbot training, but the damage has already been done. And it's something that we must be cautious of and discerning about. Generative AI perpetuates bias, and what's scary about that is it does so while presenting as a non-biased machine. Next, hallucinations. Another weakness of generative AI is its tendency to make up information or hallucinate. In addition to knowing that it can give incorrect and misleading information based on erroneous content that it was fed during its learning time, generative AI can simply make up information output and make it sound real. I didn't put it in here, but it's going to be in my book about a case of a lawyer who used generative AI to create the argument, and AI had hallucinated most of the argument and created all sorts of trouble in the court. Even the terms of use from OpenAI's ChatGPT tells the user, if you read the terms of use, that you need to fact check the output. Because its programming mimics our language, we tend to trust that any information it feeds us is accurate or factual. However, the computer is not equipped to understand as we understand, again, through soft skills of emotional and intercultural competence or interpreting contextual settings. As I said in the previous point, the programming has unknown biases, and its output is based on what is statistically the most probable sequence of words in response to our prompt. And that will create hallucinations, made up information. Next, let's go to dislocation. And this has already come up many times when I'm talking about personality and the lack of personality. Generative AI will not produce sermon content that is cultivated through the body, through experience, through awareness of a social location, for the consistency of identity over time, through testimony. It cannot do that. It can mimic those things, but it is not authentic. It is not true. Likewise, it cannot fully understand and adapt content for particular contexts, locations, and situations. This is why when playing with ChatGPT for sermon writing, the results tend to be so basic, bland, vague, and dislocated, especially when we haven't explored the art of crafting prompts that do highlight particularity. These problems and gaps related to context, the human situation, and time reveal two things that may be taken for granted in the digital age. First, an impactful sermon requires more effort than reporting academic information on a scripture passage, summarizing that information, and offering generic rules to apply to some sort of generic life, the basic moves of a chatbot sermon. If we are looking toward metaphors for preaching in this digital age, let's not choose one of an Alexa preacher who spits out facts without context or personality about God. Second, and related to the first taken for granted aspect of preaching, we may let human preachers off the hook more than we think for chatbot tendencies in the pulpit. Stripped of flesh and familiarity, information dump sermons without contextuality do not make transformative connections. It is okay that preachers have bodies and are embodied, and that we filter our theological meaning through the experience of being human. As I said earlier, some schools of thought and homiletics seemed to assume it was possible to preach without the flesh getting in the way, our experiences, our bias, our social location, and opinions. But is that the sort of incarnational preaching Jesus modeled and the early church practiced? I don't have too much time left, but I hope that we'll have further conversations about the eschatological and theological dilemmas of engaging with ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. First and foremost, of course, how can we rely upon a machine for sermons and liturgies when they cannot be in touch with divinity? And formational dilemmas that I've already mentioned. What do we lose as Christians when our pastors delegate the task of preaching to a machine rather than being formed by the weekly craft of proclamation for the congregation? These last two aspects make me think about a commercial from Apple that was swiftly criticized after its release earlier this year. In this video, which we're about to watch, we will see that the latest iPad crushes art and culture and replaces it with a single machine. But are the goods of art, including the art of preaching, only based on the product? Aren't we forgetting how the process of making art and engaging in art in a community is part of the goods, including the art of preaching? Let's watch. You can watch it on your own. Or technology is not going to work. Well, basically what you would see in the video is a bunch of art supplies and crafts being destroyed by this machine. But the machine can't crush the iPad, of course. It is indestructible. All right, well, I'm going to wrap things up. Now that you have a homework assignment, you can watch this commercial later if you haven't seen it before. But in an interview with Time Magazine, ChatGPT admitted again its weakness in the contextual aspect of communication, saying, quote, "We are not capable of understanding the context or meaning of the words we generate. We can only produce text based on the probabilities of certain words or sequences of words appearing together based on the training data we've been given," end quote. Imagine if your pastor or you yourself stood up and informed the congregation that we are not capable of understanding the context or meaning of the words we speak. Is that the sort of message that has the capacity to transform disciples of Christ? Preaching, good preaching, is a human art, inspired in content and form by the one who communicated the word and wisdom of God through human flesh. Instead of bias that harms, good preaching seeks to be otherwise and empathic, as John McClure and others describe. Instead of falling into hallucinations and making up fake news, good preaching seeks to co-conspire with the Holy Spirit, allowing prophetic imagination of what is possible in God's kingdom to emerge. And rather than dislocation, good preaching seeks to be rooted in context of the humans in the Bible, the human who is preaching, and the humans who are listening and participating in the sermon. Instead of seeking new ways to transcend our embodiedness and so dehumanize preaching, how can the art of preaching amplify the messages that only human bodies can deliver and offer one another in this age of the chatbot? These are the sorts of questions that I am focused on in my teaching and practice of preaching in this age. I look forward to being in conversation and discernment with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sigmon. What, so much rich things to think about. One of the things you said early on that I've been pondering is just the idea that preaching is formational and not just informational. And I think thinking about that helps us really kind of get at this. So lots to think about. I so appreciate your time today and just sharing your wisdom. If you have a question that you'd like Dr. Sigmon to address, please drop that in the Q&A section. We already have a few there. One that I can answer quickly is that, yes, this is being recorded and we will make it available on the disciples.org/preaching website when it's ready and processed. So. Dr. Sigmon, I wonder if you spend a lot of time talking about sort of how AI can be used for words and for written words, which is most of how we use, most of us still sort of deal in words when we preach. But I wonder if you could talk just briefly, and then we've got some other questions, but talk briefly about images and AI and how we might use those or not use that technology for images and preaching.
Yes, so AI image generation is quickly improving. I will say that I played around with it a lot last year, and any free version of these visual generators they're not great. They're pretty clunky. They're pretty limited in what they have access to and what they can create for you. But ones that you pay for can provide not just provocative images of, what if, and there's an image that circulates a lot on the internet, and it was even featured in Oprah Winfrey's special for ABC News on ChatGPT a few weeks ago, of Donald Trump and Joe Biden smiling and camping together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the generation can be used to imagine a world where, but also it can, for those who don't realize that it's created, that it's not an actual photograph, though it looks like one, manipulate the truth. So that's like the ethical boundary is like when you see a painting, something from John August Swanson about the peaceable kingdom, it's a painting, and it's not a photograph. But when the AI can create an image that looks like it's real, then there's this moment of, wait, is that real? I'm confused, and I can't tell what's true about the image.
Yes, that's helpful. The other concern I've heard about image creation too, is that we want to be aware that for many artists, their livelihoods are at stake. And if we are generating this using a free tool on the internet, are we then not supporting sort of human-made creative art? And so I think that's something to think about as well.
Definitely.
One question we have, and again, if you are listening and have a question, please drop those in the Q&A section. A very basic question: if someone has never used AI tools, where to start? How to even get to that website? Do they need to pay? Is there a subscription fee? What does that? How does one get started?
So most of the ones that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, such as ChatGPT, Perplexity AI, and Gemini, they all have like an entry-level free option of use. Gemini is integrated with Google, so it would automatically collaborate with you if you're logged into your Google account on Chrome, for example. ChatGPT and Perplexity AI, they don't even make you create an account. They allow you to engage it at an introductory level and just explore. And so all you would do is type in ChatGPT and hit enter and go and play, and it will walk you through with prompts what it's capable of doing. And same with Perplexity AI. And all of them, of course, because if there's an opportunity to make money, these companies are going to make money. They have much more that they'll brag about as being accessible if you pay. And I see the question about subscriptions. Yeah, so probably like monthly fees or a cheaper annual fee that will get you the latest and the greatest updates of what the platform is capable of doing.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I know that there was a lot of interest when you talked about using it to generate tweets, or I guess we don't call them tweets anymore, do we? Social media posts based
threads.
On yes. The question is, what did you ask it so that it would do that?
If I'm recalling correctly, I said, from this sermon content, create 10 tweets. And I think I even said for ages 18 to 35. So I was playing with particularity, and that was generated. And so I didn't even have to ask about the emojis. I didn't have to ask about the hashtags, which it also created hashtags for me. It knew the genre, it knew what to predict for the platform, and it did that with my content. So that's what I did.
Great. Thank you. There was a question about when you were talking about bias, where the bias that you described comes from.
Yeah.
How did it become biased? How did this machine generated stuff become biased?
So again, it's very complex. But for ChatGPT, for example, its machine learning process, it just so happened that the text that it was learning from, digitized text, mostly from the internet that it was fed, was done so in Western, North American English speaking perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so inherently, that is the pattern, those patterns of thinking and speaking. And they have not been able to undo that doing yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, platforms that are really present on the internet now and pulling content now. Again, you think about how much is out there on the internet where anyone can produce content, and there's a lot of hate-filled rhetoric and harmful rhetoric that is accessible. Mm-hmm. And teaching the machines how to predict language, right? And so the bias is everywhere, and the danger is that we assume a machine can't be biased,
right.
And then it can affirm and confirm prejudice all too easily, especially for folks who don't have media literacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately it is pulling on human created content, right?
Yes.
It's a circle in some ways where
exactly
it's just pulling on the same biased stuff that we gave it. Yeah. Thank you. Here's an interesting question. What are your thoughts about ChatGPT's ability to make text or hymns or other things more inclusive or more progressive?
That's a great question, because as you can see, if you prompt it in that direction, it is capable of producing a draft of something that can really be like, wow. I have friends who've used it to play around with poetry exercises, and it can create some really beautiful poems that you're like, wow, can't believe a human didn't come up with that, except a human did, and they're pulling it from that human without citing that human. But same with hymns. That's probably what you'll see, is that you might go, you know what, that phrase sounds really familiar. And very, very likely that, hey, that's from Ruth Duck, but ChatGPT is not going to say that it's from Ruth Duck. That idea has just been dislocated from its original creator and then offered to you as if it is an original piece. All that to say, again, technology is not good, bad, neutral. Use discernment if you do play around for brainstorming and making hymns more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that raised a question for me too about citation, I think, for lack of a better word. What do we tell our congregations or our communities about if and when we are using AI generated material? So I think, in a sermon, if I was going to quote a book that I'd read, I would say, this is from XYZ book by this author. But if I'm using some kind of AI generated material in some way, do I have a responsibility to say that, and how?
I think yes, and yes, you have a responsibility to say it. I think it could be really educational for the community to be like, wow, okay, the pastor's playing around with AI. And this is something that we're working on in our handbooks at the seminary, right? And in the academy is, all right, how do we teach citation? And Fiona, the cat, is, she's held off so long, but she can wait no longer to say hello to everybody.
Is she a real cat or an AI?
She's a real cat. That is not an AI cat. That's Fiona. She's going to make me sneeze. So kind of like the basics of citation. So this is the platform I used. This was the prompt that I gave. And these are the sections that I'm quoting that came from ChatGPT or came from Perplexity AI. And it's really important to do that and include a date, because I find that it doesn't always repeat itself exactly, right? So it is learning. It is learning every day, every hour, based on the engagement with more and more content and more prompts. And so that means that a parishioner can't go home, do the exact same prompt on the exact same platform, and necessarily get the exact same content. So you have to be specific. in your
So
citation.
it's different than citing a book in which you could go back and find exactly the same quote. You won't, perhaps.
Exactly. It's fluid. You
Yeah, that's
cannot pin it
fascinating.
down.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. If there are other questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. One other thing that I thought of as you were talking about, and this is not a super well-formed thought, but I wonder if there's something to think about as preachers about the idea that it is predictability that this is built on, that it is trying to predict something and it is a predictable tool. But for preachers and for those of us who talk about sort of the life of faith, I mean, we often talk about how God is not predictable. And the
Yes.
entire Christian story is built on an incredibly unpredictable ending, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't, that's as far as I got with that thought. But I think there's something to hold in tension there.
Oh, definitely. I really, I'm concerned about a sermon that just confirms, affirms everything that I already know. And it's like, well, yeah, but if we know it, why aren't we living it? And why is the world still broken? And
Yes.
how then can a sermon that's produced by generative AI and predictability do the work of like holy disorientation so that we can be reoriented to the priorities and presence of God?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Sigmon. I just appreciate your wisdom. Oh, we've got a couple more questions. Let me not rush too far ahead from there. Yes.
Yes,
So, question about images and are the same
it does.
biases existing?
It does, Brian. I'm trying to, there's a New York Times article, I believe, or it might have been the Atlantic, but there was an example of generate an image of a doctor, generate an image of a nurse. And like, what do you think? What do you think is the image that shows up, right? It's a white male when it's a doctor, and it's a female when it's a nurse, right? So yes, it does the same thing with image generation.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yep. And then, Nathan asked about the issues of labor instead of buying a book and supporting an author, an artist.
Always.
That's an issue we want to think about as well.
Oh yeah, and also as I was talking to my colleague this morning, Reverend Amy Shoemaker, shout out, I know she's there. The costs on the environment, right? When we are using so much water to keep these supercomputers functioning in times of drought and times when people in Flint, Michigan still don't have clean water. What are our priorities and why?
Mm-hmm. So back to your original point that it is a tool, and like any tool, we need to evaluate the costs and the benefits when we use it. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, this has been rich. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and giving us lots to think about. At this point, folks, if you are listening, we're going to close our time together, but I don't want you to rush off. If you would like to stick around and talk with some other preachers in small groups. So we're going to say goodbye to Dr. Sigmon, and then I'll give some further instructions. Thank you so much. So at the top of the screen, you will see a tab that says Lounge. And in just a minute, we'll open up those lounges and you can join one if you'd like. It functions just like a small group breakout room. And that's a very informal conversation. You're simply invited to hop in there, introduce yourself, and then share something you heard today that you'd like to think about more or might be meaningful in your own preaching life. And if that's not something you want to do, or if you need to go on with your day, that is fine. But if you're able to stay a few more minutes and connect with another preacher, please do. Again, please visit disciples.org/preaching to hear about all of our programs, including those grants for bivocational preachers. Our fall application window just opened, so you want to check that out and share that with your networks. And I also look forward to seeing many of you at our preaching retreat at the end of October. We're sold out in rooms at the retreat center, but we do have some capacity for a few more commuter registrations, and we have some other places to stay nearby. So check that out if you're interested and able to join us. Finally, just a quick word of thanks to my colleague Brenda Rossi, who has been helping out behind the scenes and making this happen. And again, thanks to Daphne Gascott Arias for translating. We'll give them a little shout out in the chat. They'd appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for sharing your time and your gifts and for the ministry you do. So now if you'd like to join a small group conversation, click over to the lounge area and hop in a room. We will keep those open for the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you again for coming.